So for those of you that are unfamiliar with the Munden project, our specialty is solving complex problems. We're a boutique consultancy. We focus in 3 areas. One is asset management, so that's investment problems, how to generate return on capital. The second is technology, which was my background as a software architect in finance, and so how to create better technological systems to deal with a number of different issues. And then the third is development. We've taken an interest in problems that relate to the junction of leaving the planet in better shape for future generations, but also making sure that that planet is given a fair shake to everybody that's living on it. Within that, we are often asked, on this issue of land tenure, how do we engage the private sector? That's an extremely common question that gets raised. First thing you have to understand in answering it is there's no such thing. Private sector does not exist. That's not an actual entity. We do not conduct meetings on a regular basis to decide what will happen in certain parts of the world. It's a very, very, very diverse set of interests. To try to think about that, maybe from a perspective you might understand a little bit better, think if I said government, right? In the United States, if I wanted to go with a meeting with government, I might go meet with the Environmental Protection Agency. I might, less felicitously, go meet with the IRS, the tax people. I might also meet with the Pentagon. All of these are government organizations, but they have different responsibilities. They have different interests. You have different asks of them when you go to meet with them. And therefore, you require different strategies to talk to them. The private sector is no different in that regard, and I'll talk about 3 very specific examples of classes of organizations that we've talked to about this issue of land tenure. One is mining companies. The next is private equity funds. And the last is sovereign wealth funds, non-Swedish sovereign wealth funds. We haven't had any conversations with anyone here. These points of engagement with them tend to be different. Mining companies, for example, don't really tend to have a choice about the location of where their activity is. The ore body is where it is. The same is true of oil and gas companies, generally outside of the pipelines. Therefore, you have to talk to them about implementation, how to get things done. It's a different conversation with a private equity firm that may be looking at a specific transaction or set of transactions at the ground level. With those folks, you want to talk to them more about how this issue impacts diligence and colors their view of that specific transaction. I would also add, because this also is, I think, a misunderstanding, folks tend not to understand that the diligence issue from that perspective is not simply a question of whether to do an investment or not. Very often, you discover things in a diligence process that lead to a change in the valuation of what you're investing in. So they have an incentive to discover information that can give them a better position in negotiation. Thirdly, with respect to sovereign wealth funds, our conversations with them have mostly been about risk, trying to identify problems in their portfolios. Our perception is that they tend to be a little bit understaffed relative to assets under management. They've got quite a lot of things to think about, and so you have to present them kind of a pretty compact argument for this issue. Also recognize that when you're dealing with a sovereign wealth fund, you're talking about very different things depending on what they put their money into. So equities, for example, investments in stocks and that sort of stuff, are very different conversations than talking about people that do alternative investments where they're maybe participating a little bit more directly in land. What you have at the end of the day, though, is a sales process. And here I'd like to get a really key message across. The best sales process, and I say this just, I've spent my whole life as an entrepreneur and I've seen sales in various different forms. The absolute best sales process is when you have a good product. You have something that people can buy. You all have the facts on your side. That helps. That makes a significant difference. What you are saying is true. You are not trying to bullshit people. You have to keep that in mind, and it informs how you engage with them. Let me be specific about that. Everybody goes through whether you're talking about a mining company, PE fund, SWF, you're going through the same kind of Glengarry, Glen Ross process, for those of you that are familiar with the movie. Attention, interest, decision, and action, okay? So getting their attention at the beginning of the conversation. Generally, this happens around citing a specific case or two. They've got to sort of see what the problem looks like. And here, you have a very, very different universe of possibilities. With mining companies, they will invariably have some experience. This has happened. You know, whether to them directly in a project maybe they were an engineer on or involved in, or somewhere else in the company, they know what you're talking about. They do not need to be told the consequences of this particular issue. They've engaged with it. You need instead, when talking to them, to understand how that experience relates to a broader picture that you're trying to say. So you're trying to say this was not a tail risk. This is not a random event. This happens, you know, a little bit more systematically. With respect to a private equity fund, you want to frame it more as the difference between deals that may be on their table that are otherwise similar in appearance. So the way that we will tend to talk to them is we say, okay, look, you're looking at two very similar deals, say in Latin America, in adjacent countries. I'll pick two out of the air. You're looking at one in Colombia, and you're looking at another, say, in Peru, okay? And these deals financially, in terms of offtake, like who's buying the product that comes out of them, that, you know, that sort of stuff, may be very similar in a lot of different ways. But the fact that there are very different tenure environments in those two places is something that is a piece of information they may not currently have, but allows them to differentiate between this. So they can already see the practical use of that kind of information. On the sovereign wealth fund side, it's a little bit different process. You've got to start by aggregating cases that link to returns, okay? It has to be a little bit of a broader, colder argument with them, at least in our experience, than with respect to the other two categories. The second point, interest. You need to sell the same story to each of them. This is not an outlier. So what we just talked about with these specific examples is not, you know, again, random behavior and, you know, well, just damn unlucky, you know, happened to be the wrong place. You know, this one tribe got ticked off. Well, who could have guessed? No. Instead, you send two messages, and you send those messages with data. The first is concessions equal people, and those people are unavoidable counterparties. Whether the government that's promoting the investment that came to you to sell this particular idea or get you into the bidding process tells you this or not, there is almost no such thing as an uninhabited concession. We can show that. We can demonstrate that with geospatial data now. The second thing is that there is a high propensity for these counterparties to cause issues for investments if their concerns are not satisfied, particularly in emerging markets and frontier markets. Okay, that's a broad a designation that you might call developing countries, but are slightly different to people from our world in a way that probably isn't worth time spending on. At that point, you've given them something that they can kind of, okay, get their interest around. You then have to get them to a decision. You want their decision in all three cases to be deal with this systemically. Don't deal with this transactionally. Don't deal with this in, you know, as a one-off. It is not in your interest to do so because that is expensive. It's costly. It's a pain in the ass. Instead, present them with a way in which they can do this on a repeatable basis. In the case of the mining companies, what we've heard is, yeah, we know that. We have a labor shortage. We don't know who we can get in touch with that deals with this sort of problem. Where can we go? Maybe something like the Tenure facility, if it provided that kind of information, would be able to fill that kind of gap. Because right now they don't really, you know, even well-intentioned project developers just don't have anywhere to go. On the PE fund side, you've got to have a conversation that leads them to a network of diligence experts and a screening process. They're not going to develop that themselves. You've got to put that in front of them. and enable them to be able to implement it. Who do I, if I want to do a deal in this particular place, who do I call, and what's the screening process for you even get to that deal in the first place? For example, I'm probably not going to diligence, land rights as strongly, say in the UK, as I would if I were looking at an investment in Brazil. Lastly, with respect to the sovereign wealth fund, again, things are a little bit more complex. First, we notice that they tend to have to go through an internal sales process. In other words, you'll deal with somebody, but they tend to have a lot of conversations internally. And so you've got to present them first with information that is objective and verifiable. They tend to be fairly suspicious of NGOs, at least in our experience. And that's because there's frankly, there's a little bit of a conflict of interest, right? If you think that a particular issue is important, and you're also the one generating the data about that issue, well, what do you expect? I mean, it would be the same as if somebody came to me with an investment opportunity, but also gave me the financial model. Of course, I would check that financial model out, right? If you give them objective and verifiable data, though, they go through that process, and then that getting used, if you get that engagement for them to make a decision, they also need to see how this plugs into models. And that's a fairly technical point, but we think pretty key. They've got to see how they integrate this somewhat unique judgment of risk into their investment processes, and that means basically Excel. The final point in closing. We've talked about attention, we've talked about interest, we've talked about decisions. What about the action? I'll get back to what I said before. We have essentially a correct set of facts. And so there has to be a little bit of faith in the engagement. You cannot engage with them expecting that they will tell you what the output is. You instead have to have faith that presented with this information, you've got their attention, right? You have their interest in this particular problem, you've led them to some decisions and given them the ability to make those decisions and take action on them, that those actions will be in your favor because you are putting something on the radar which at the moment is invisible. Thanks.